Hello and welcome to HIMSS TV. I'm Susan Morse, Managing Editor of Healthcare Finance News. We are here today with Nicole Neumarker, Executive Vice President of Development and Innovation at Cotiviti. I'm also here with Derek Baird, who is President North America for Sensign Health. And we are here today talking about ethical data sharing. And I'm wondering if you can start by talking about why is ethical data sharing so crucial, especially when it comes to patient health information. We know about HIPAA law. What about beyond that? And Nicole, would you like to start out?
So I think one of the important things I see going on is that because sharing healthcare data has a lot of technical friction to it, what's happening is those who are solving the technical friction are becoming de facto owners of that data when I don't know that they truly are the de facto owners. They become stewards of it, they manage it. So what you find is when technologists can find a way to quickly solve those interoperability and friction problems, suddenly they are holding the gold, which is healthcare data. And I think in reality, it is patients who truly own their own data. But I think some of the conversations we might have going further, we can talk about why they are the true owners versus, say, those who are best at moving the data around.
I mean, I agree. There are certainly a lot of companies that are either as part of their core business or as a byproduct of their other digital health businesses that are aiming to use clinical data. And I agree with Nicole. It can't necessarily be those that go fastest or come up with the right technology approach that are necessarily entrusted with patient data. I do think that stating the obvious, the use of patient data requires a careful, thoughtful, ethical approach. And we as an industry need to take a stance on what that is and hold ourselves to a higher bar than many other industries have. It's one thing for technology companies to look at and share my rather boring web browsing history. But I think we would all agree that patient data, many of us consider that personal. And I think a lot of people rightfully consider it sacred. And we just need to hold ourselves to a higher standard. And I say we as an entire industry, and look at the ethics and the guardrails that need to be around this.
Well, how do we do this, especially when interoperability, of course, is taking hold and that all healthcare organizations need to think about that?
Well, I think one of the things that when I think about this it's a very broad question, ethical data in healthcare. But one of the first things I think of, and Derek alluded to this, which is today you can't open a web browser without opting in to what kind of data is going to be shared, how it's going to be used, et cetera. Yet, when do we opt in to the usage of our healthcare data? I mean, we kind of do when we work with insurance companies, and those we get insured and we sign off the insurers, of course, in order to give us services to work with providers need access to our healthcare data. But at what point are we opting in to various types of usage of that data? I don't know that we have that well defined in the ways that, a lot of laws have been passed just recently, actually, about how web data can get used. If you use that same paradigm and you transfer it to patient data, where is the opt-in framework for that? How do we know what data is being used in what transactions and how is it correlated back to the patient? I think starting with a framework for opting in or understanding usage, I think is a really first important step. I'm sure Derek has other ideas too as well.
Yeah, I think particularly for de-identified clinical data, which all the work that we do at Sensign is with de-identified data, healthcare providers have found themselves in the position of housing and in some ways becoming stewards of those data sets. Of course, other data types where you need patient consent, you've got to stick the landing on the patients consenting in the right way and understanding what they're signing off on. But for de-identified clinical data, I think in many ways the onus is on health systems to be careful and thoughtful about the partnerships that they strike with industry. and not let any ambiguity or misunderstandings occur in terms of how the de-identified clinical data are used and where it's going and what, vague secondary use rights may be embedded on page 57 of the agreement. And there have been some mistakes in the past on this front, but I talk to at least a dozen health systems a week, and I think many of them are becoming more aware and more careful in how they partner, how clinical data is part of the equation, and making sure that there are no surprises. I think Nicole's right. I mean, the regulatory stuff, it's pretty black and white. It's, of course, that's HIPAA here, and in our work in the EU and UK, it's GDPR. But you've got to go beyond that. And so I think additional information governance, technology belts and suspenders, and just transparency and honesty around how the data are being used and for what purpose. If I were a health system executive, I would be demanding that. And I think thankfully the days are ending where data might be sneaking out the side door or the back door. And, there are ways to really use it in an ethical way for greater good. You've just got to ensure you understand what the path is out the front door.
Well, you said health executives should be demanding this, but what can be done? Are there solutions out there? Are there practical ways that health systems and payers can better protect patient data?
Yeah, Derek alluded to one of them. He alluded to patient de-identification. And I think in leveraging and ensuring that when you're going to use data in maybe a methodology that it wasn't originally intended for, that you have super clear understanding of how you're de-identifying that data, what technologies you've used. And I know there's some sort of maybe debate about who gets to certify whether something is de-identified or not, and what does that mean to be certified de-identified? I've tried using tools, or I shouldn't say try. I've taken tools, put them in front of my compliance team and said, "Is this good enough?" And they've said, "No, it's not good enough." So we've gone back to the drawing board, and that means you really need to have a rigorous understanding of what it means to take data in its current form, de-identify it, and leverage it. I think with AI as a voracious consumer of data, okay, great. You can have it consume that data, identified or de-identified with the right cohorts or not. But that's a really important equation, that de-identification stage, if we're really going to leverage that data in more broader contexts without this understanding of patient opt-in and understanding of usage. Derek also alluded to the idea of transparency. He's absolutely right. Without patients really having transparency into how their data is being used, how do you opt in to something you don't know is even happening? So both sides of that equation, I think, are super important if we're going to actually leverage data in meaningful ways beyond just the very strict sort of siloed nature of provider-patient. And I think that's where everyone's trying to get to. But the questions you're asking, Susan, are really important to be answered before we can get to that true interoperability across the ecosystem.
Do you want to add anything to that, Derek?
Yeah, I think there's a strike zone here that has the right balance, between what Nicole just said in her last point. There is great promise and potential here, and there are already fantastic examples of how de-identified clinical data have been used for new discoveries. I don't think we've done a great job storytelling and helping patients understand the benefits if this is done right.
Nicole, while I have you on the line, you were talking about getting patients on board. How do you do that? How do you get the patients involved with wanting to know about their own data? I mean, right now, are patients not really used to getting it?
They're not used to getting it, but I'll use a personal example. I was trying to get at just my own medical record at one point for something that I'd gone through, and you'd think that, and this provider was part of a fairly significant EHR platform, one we'd all know well, and I do think that on some level, if the payers and the insurance companies aren't enabling tools within the EHR systems that they work with those providers, it's really difficult for it to be easy for a patient to engage in that way. So as an example, to get this medical record, I had to fill out a PDF, and then I got it back as a PDF all through encrypted email, versus having that whole interaction and interplay in the context of maybe an EHR system where, in theory, it would have given me much greater context to what I was reading, right? If I'm reading this document, it's much harder to consume, print it out, than it was, say, if I could navigate it through an EHR, something that's contextual and meaningful. So I think there's a partnership that needs to emerge between EHR providers, patients, payers, others who are invested in this ecosystem to enable that user experience, as we like to say in other contexts, the user experience of the patient to engage in their data meaningfully. I don't know that they know how to ask it, and they're not aggregated in power to ask for that, because I, as one patient, can't say, hey, medical system, go change your whole system so that it's easier for me to consume. That's not going to happen, right? So it behooves us as, private public partnerships to engage together and solve for that. Welcome back, Derek.
Yes, welcome back, Derek. But
Never fails.
Aren't health systems being mandated to do that now? I mean, how does this come up against interoperability standards? Derek, why don't you start on that one?
Yeah, the new standards certainly help and put some needed guardrails around this. But again, when it comes to data sharing partnerships between health systems or payers and other companies, again, it's HIPAA helps, but industry needs to step up and do more. And, that's why I'm a little bit biased, but I think the ethical, overly conservative, or maybe properly conservative approach that SenSign takes, doesn't get in the way of the potential of AI, but also gives people the comfort and confidence they need to know that the data aren't going to make their way elsewhere or just be used for, daily fishing expeditions.
Yeah.
And that's really what everyone is rightfully questioning and wants clear answers to.
Yeah. Nicole, any closing thoughts?
I think a lot of the laws are driving the ask of interoperability, and I think that's the right ask. It also drives, though, a level of porousness in the typical frameworks that data is held. So when you have that interoperability, you've created a porous environment where it can flow freely. And I think without sort of a semblance of understanding of what those frameworks should look like legally, in partnership with, both industry and government, I think the interoperability might run ahead of the understanding of usage. Because if you've got a company maybe that has the right intent, awesome. But there are plenty of ways we've watched play out on a national stage how social data is monetized. And I think when you see that, you take that analogy and you apply it then to healthcare data, where monetization is the motivation, not necessarily solving for healthcare problems. If we don't get ahead of that, in essence, the monetization strategies will run ahead of trying to solve for healthcare strategies. And I think that's what, why we're talking today, is to how do we in industry ensure that doesn't happen, as we are currently the stewards of that data. And when we see it monetized out in the broader context of industry, they may not, hold dear the sort of HIPAA culture that I think we do in healthcare. I think that's where we need some work.
I feel that we've just caught the tip of the iceberg of this conversation. It's been fascinating. Thank you both so much. And perhaps in the future, we can go into this in more detail, and that would be terrific. Thank you, Nicole. Thank you, Derek, for joining us on HIMSS TV today.
Happy to be here. Thank you, Susan.
Thanks, Susan.